The year was 2468. The world had changed in ways people from the old Earth could hardly dream of. Great floating citadels hung above the silver clouds, and cities gleamed like jewels on the surface below. But even with all the shining towers, peace was never simple. Kingdoms still argued, armies still marched, and people still needed someone brave to stand between them and danger. That someone was Ethan Ward. He was called the Human Champion, and not because he wanted fame. He had fought hard since his youth, first as a soldier and later as the leader of the Queen's Royal Guard. He never thought himself a hero, only a man doing what had to be done. But for every victory, his name spread further across the realm until even children in the lowest farm colonies whispered stories of how he had stood unbroken while others fled. Though the people loved him, Ethan found no joy in glory. The more he won, the more he saw what war truly cost. The faces of those he could not save haunted his dreams. Many thought he was made of stone, but he was simply careful to hide the pain inside. When the last rebellion ended and the dust had hardly settled, he hoped for peace just once, long enough to breathe in silence. That peace did not last. Rumors reached the capital that rebellion was stirring again on Mars. The leaders there had begun testing forbidden weapons and speaking against the throne. The message reached the Queen quickly. Her name was Leora Hale, and she had been crowned only 4 years earlier. People called her the Golden Queen because she ruled with grace and fairness. But even her kindness could not stop war from finding her. When the news arrived, the Royal Council argued for hours. Many urged the Queen to send a fleet and crush the uprising at once. Others begged her to wait, to talk, to find a way that did not spill blood. But Queen Leora listened quietly and then gave her answer. She would summon Ethan Ward to her citadel. Ethan was resting when the summon came. He had not been to the royal citadel for months. It floated above the blue-white clouds like a pearl in the sky, held steady by vast engines that hummed like distant thunder. As his small transport ship rose through the mist, he felt a small knot form in his stomach. He had faced armies and death without fear, yet the thought of standing before the Queen always made him uneasy. The citadel gates opened with a low sound, and guards in silver armor lined the path. Beyond them, the Queen waited in the great hall, a place of pale marble and hanging banners. She looked younger than Ethan remembered, or perhaps just more human, without the formal masks she wore during ceremonies. When she smiled, it seemed to soften the whole room. "Rise, Ethan Ward," she said gently when he knelt. "I called you not as a ruler commands a soldier, but as one human asks another for help." He stood and could see the weight behind her eyes. "Then I will help, Your Majesty," he said simply. "If it's within my power." "The colonies are once again restless," she said. "They believe I am too young to rule. They seek to take what we built and tear it apart. You ended the last war. I fear we cannot survive another without you." Ethan wanted to refuse. His body was tired, his spirit heavy. But he looked at her and remembered the oath he had sworn all those years ago. The Queen, even as a ruler, seemed fragile in that moment, a woman standing against a storm far larger than herself. "You will not face this alone," he said at last. A faint sigh of relief passed her lips. "Then I will trust you as I always have." The meeting ended soon after, but long after he left the hall, Ethan could not forget the look in her eyes. They were filled not just with duty, but with loneliness, as though the crown itself was both her light and her cage. Outside, as his ship carried him over the wide curve of the clouds, he looked back at the citadel. The sun caught its towers and made them shine like gold. Somewhere inside that bright fortress was a woman who ruled the world, yet had no one to share her fears with. Ethan did not know it yet, but this mission would change both of their lives in ways neither could imagine. For now he was only a soldier once more, bound for a war he did not want, serving a queen who had never needed him more. The engines roared beneath him, and the sky opened wide. He looked forward into the endless blue, where destiny waited, silent and unseen. The long journey to the warfront gave Ethan Ward far too much time to think. When he landed at the fortress of Stonevale, the soldiers there were tired and frightened. They had seen too much already. Ethan walked among them, speaking with plain words, not orders. He told them that every person mattered, and that no one was fighting alone. Some of the men began to lift their heads a little higher as they listened. He had that strange gift, not just of commanding, but of reminding others that they still had hearts inside their chests. The first battles came swiftly. The rebels had strange new weapons built with stolen science, and every fight was a test of quick thought and steady courage. Ethan led from the front. His armor was dented and scorched, but he never stopped moving. He only hoped to end the war before it swallowed more lives. Back on Earth, Queen Leora followed every report with tight hands. She spent sleepless nights watching the glowing maps on her council table, waiting for each new message. Every report that said Ethan had survived brought a quiet relief she could not explain, even to herself. When he had stood before her in the marble hall, she had felt something she had never allowed herself to feel before, kind of safety she had long forgotten. Now, that feeling was both her comfort and her fear. Weeks turned into months. Battles were won and lost. The war shifted like a restless sea. Then one evening, while the queen was working alone in her chamber, the door opened and a tired guard stepped inside. He handed her a small folded note, marked with Ethan's seal. It was short and simple, written in his plain hand. I wish this war would end soon so we may all breathe again. She read it many times before setting it down. Something inside her chest ached in a way she could not name. For the first time in her reign, she wished she were not queen at all. Only a woman who could thank a man without the weight of a crown between them. The rebel leaders were captured, and the colonies sent word of surrender. Ethan was badly hurt in the last attack. His ship returned to the citadel carrying him on a stretcher, covered in dust and blood. The queen left her court and rushed down to the medical ward without announcing herself to anyone. Ethan lay on a white bed, his eyes closed. The healers bowed deeply, but she told them to leave. And you gave it, Ethan, she replied softly. Even at the cost of yourself. She stayed by his side for days as he healed. Each time he woke, they spoke not as ruler and soldier, but as two souls who had seen too much and longed for something simple. They talked of quiet places beyond the cities, where rivers still ran free and skies were clear. They smiled at small jokes and forgot for a moment that the world demanded so much from both of them. When Ethan was strong enough to walk again, the queen invited him to dine privately. It was a small room with a single candle and a view of the stars through crystal glass. They ate little and spoke much. Their laughter was quiet, almost shy. In that light, she no longer looked like a queen, and he no longer looked like a soldier. The bond between them grew quietly after that. The palace guards noticed he stayed longer after meetings. Courtiers whispered that the queen smiled more often. One night, when the celebration of victory filled the air, Ethan walked out onto the high balcony and looked down at the glittering kingdom below. We did it, she said quietly. The days after the victory were bright and full of noise. Music filled the great halls of the citadel, and banners waved above every balcony. The war was over at last, and the realm seemed to breathe in relief. Yet, for Ethan Ward, peace felt strange. He had spent his life fighting, always moving, always ready. Now there was silence, and he did not quite know how to live inside it. They spoke of small things, of morning walks through the gardens, of how the clouds looked when seen from the highest tower. Ethan found himself laughing again, something he had not done for years. The queen, freed for a while from council duties, began to seem more like herself, not the figure on the throne, but a woman with warmth and wit. Together, they would talk long into the night until the candles burned low and dawn crept through the windows. The people of the citadel began to whisper, first in amusement, then in awe. They said their queen and her champion understood each other with a single glance. Ethan tried to ignore such talk, yet he could not deny that when she smiled at him across the hall, something inside him stirred that had nothing to do with duty or honor. One evening, the queen held a private gathering to mark the end of the war. It was not the grand parade the council wanted. She wished only for a small group of those who had given their hearts to the cause. There were soft lights, music, and warm wine. As the night grew deeper, the guests drifted away, leaving only the two of them by the window. The stars hung close, clear, and sharp. The world below shimmered like a field of fireflies. The queen poured the last of the wine and handed him a glass. "A toast," she said. "To peace," he answered. "To what peace costs," she said softly. They drank, and silence settled around them. The kind of silence that holds to people in the same thought. Ethan wanted to speak, to tell her what he felt, but no words seemed worthy. She looked at him, her eyes bright but uncertain. "You never ask for anything, do you, Ethan?" she said finally. "Have what I meant to have," he replied. "The rest was never mine to ask for." Her eyes flickered down for a moment. "Maybe I want you to ask this time," she whispered. He stepped closer, feeling as though the world had grown impossibly still. The air between them felt alive. When she lifted her hand, it trembled just a little, and he caught it in his. There was no plan, no decision, only the pull of something deep and quiet and true. Later that night, she walked with him through the quiet corridors of the palace. The guards stood still, as statues as they passed. Out on the royal balcony, where the light from the city faded into the clouds, they stood together again. "I never thought peace would feel like this," Ethan said softly. "Like what?" she asked. "Like it might break if we breathe too loud," he answered. She smiled faintly. "Then we will breathe gently." The wind moved around them, carrying the scent of rain and stone. She leaned against him, resting her head on his shoulder, as though she had every right to do so. In that simple act, all the walls between queen and soldier quietly fell away. They did not speak again. The moment did not need words. Time felt slower, stretching out as though the world wished them to stay like that forever. Neither of them knew what the dawn would bring or what the whispers in the palace would soon become. They only knew that for that one quiet night under the wide blue skies, they were no longer queen and champion, ruler and servant. They were just Leora and Ethan, two tired hearts who had found each other at last. The days after the night of the celebration felt both bright and uncertain. The queen still smiled in public, still moved through her duties with grace, but a quiet change had settled inside her. She thought of Ethan more often than before, not as her soldier, but as the person who had looked at her and seen not the crown, but simply the woman who wore it. Ethan, too, found his heart restless. He tried to bury himself in work, to act as though nothing had changed, but he could not forget the feel of her hand in his, or the sound of her laughter when the world around them had been silent. Each time the palace command called his name, he answered, but each word felt heavier than it once had. Life inside the citadel went on as before. Outside, the empire mended its wounds. Rebuilt towns rose beneath the silver skies, and soldiers returned home. Yet within the shining walls of the palace, whispers began to grow. Servants spoke softly of how the queen lingered by the west terrace at night, looking out at the stars. Guards noticed that the championess door and the queeness balcony light often glowed long after the rest of the palace had gone dark. One evening, while rain touched the high windows, Ethan was called to the queen once more. He entered quietly, his boots wet from the walk across the marble floors. She stood near the fire, her pale dress glimmering faintly in the glow. For a long moment, neither spoke. "You have been avoiding me," she said after a while, her voice soft but steady. "I thought it was better," he said, "for you. For the crown." She looked at him then, her expression unreadable, "And for you." He could not meet her gaze. "For me too." She stepped closer, standing barely a breath away. "Does it hurt you so much to see me?" "It hurts only because I remember what it feels like not to be a queen and not be a soldier," he said. "But we are both chained to what we are." She looked down, her eyes reflecting the flames. "Maybe the chains are of our own making," she whispered. The room was quiet except for the soft sound of the rain. When their hands touched again, there was no decision in it, no plan. It was as natural as breathing. That night their unspoken affection became something neither would ever forget. It was not born of pride or power, but of the deep loneliness of two people who had carried too much for too long. But peace such as this is never safe in a palace made of marble and secrets. Weeks passed, and duties pulled Ethan back to distant places. The queen continued to rule wisely, yet her mind seemed often far away. The council grew uneasy as her health began to shift. She tired more easily, her face often pale, though her smile remained. One morning, her trusted handmaid entered her chamber and found the queen sitting quietly by the window, her hands resting on her lap, her eyes bright in the light of dawn. She asked the handmaid to send for her doctor but told no one else. Secret known by a few is still a heavy burden, and the doctor's face changed when he finished his examination. The queen sat in silence after he told her. She had expected perhaps many things, but not this. There, in the quiet of her private chamber, she understood how her life was about to change. Was carrying the child of the man she loved, the man who swore oaths to protect her realm, but not to share her life. Days turned into slow weeks. There were attempts to hide the truth, to keep her condition unseen from courtiers and foreign envoys. She covered it with the poise of a ruler, smiling as if nothing were different. Yet, when she was alone, she placed her hand gently over her stomach and whispered words that no one else would ever hear. Ethan was far from the citadel during those months, sent to oversee peace pacts with the frontier nations. When he finally received a message marked with the Queen's seal, he hurried back as soon as his ship could fly. When he arrived, the Queen was waiting for him in her private garden, where soft sunlight fell between the green leaves. Her face was calm, though there was something deeper in her eyes now. "Ethan," she said quietly, "you must promise to listen before you speak." He nodded, unsure what storm was coming. She took his hand and placed it where her heartbeat was strongest. "There will soon be a child," she said, "our child." For a moment he could not breathe. His eyes widened, his mind twisting with disbelief and sudden emotion. She nodded once. "I tried to keep it secret, but I could not hide it forever. I need your strength, not as my champion, but as the father of what is to come." Ethan fell silent. Then, as the truth sank in, he knelt before her. "You should not face this alone," he said at last. Her eyes softened, but there was sorrow within them too. "You know how the council will see this? You know what danger it brings to both you and me?" "I do not care," he said. "Let the world say what it wishes. I will stand beside you." And in that garden, beneath the rising light of a new day, their hands clasped. For the first time, they faced not a battlefield but a future one, unknown, frightening, and yet full of hope. The months after the truth came into light were the hardest the Queen had ever faced. The council grew restless. They began to notice her health changing and her tired walks through the palace corridors. Whispers moved like quiet storm winds through the court. Some said the Queen was sick, others guessed she was hiding something far deeper. Yet she carried herself with calm and quiet strength. Her eyes stayed warm when she spoke to her people, her smile never fading. Ethan remained close, but hidden from sight, as she asked. He trained new guards, visited soldiers returning from the war, and kept his head bowed whenever the nobles passed. But every night he found a way to see her, even for a moment, somewhere in the silent parts of the citadel. The weight of their secret pressed heavy on them both. Still, when they were together, the noise of the world disappeared. Then the season of storms arrived. Great clouds rolled over the shining towers, and thunder shook the silver skies. On one such night the queen called for Ethan. He came quickly, knowing something had changed. When he saw her pale face, he understood. The time had come. The doctor and the handmaid stayed close while Ethan waited outside the chamber door, hearing only the soft voices beyond it. The castle was quiet except for the rain and the wind. Every sound in the hall echoed in his chest. He had faced battles, flames, and death itself. Yet this waiting broke him in ways no war ever had. At last a cry rose from within the room, a single tiny sound that sliced through the silence and filled the halls with life. The door opened, and the handmaid stepped out, her eyes shining with tears and joy. "A son," she said, her voice trembling. Ethan moved inside, slow and unbelieving. The queen lay in her bed, pale but smiling. She held a small child, wrapped in soft white cloth. She looked at Ethan, and for a moment there was nothing else in the world. "His name will be Orion," she said gently. "He will walk in light, even when the skies are dark." Ethan stood beside her, his heart racing with pride and fear. He reached out and touched the small hand of the child who barely opened his eyes. That touch felt like a promise he could never break. In the days that followed, the queen made a bold choice. She called her council together and spoke before them without fear. She told them of the child and of its father, and she did not bow her head. Her voice was steady and clear. Many of the nobles gasped, a few murmured in anger. But her strength and honesty silenced them. "You may think the crown weak for love," she said, "but love is not weakness. It is the reason any of you have ever lifted a sword to defend our home. This child is not a scandal. He is the proof that even those who carry crowns are human." The council fell quiet. Not all agreed, but none dared to challenge her courage. Ethan, standing behind her, felt his chest tighten with pride. She had faced what no weapon could defeat, the judgment of those bound by their own fear, and she had won. Years passed. The boy grew strong and curious. He had his mother's eyes and his father's spirit. The people who once whispered in secret began to cheer for their queen and her son. The story of the champion who loved his queen turned into legend. What had begun in rumor became something admired by hearts that yearned for hope. Ethan no longer called himself the queen's guard. Instead, he became her closest advisor, though their love remained quiet and steady. They spent mornings walking along the gardens where gold light touched the flowers, nights together reading old stories to their son beneath the soft hum of the stars. When the queen grew older, she stood on the same balcony where she once watched the war end. Ethan stood beside her, their hands resting together on the stone rail. Below them, the capital shone like a sea of light. "Do you remember the first time you came here?" she asked softly. "I remember every moment," he said. "You were the same then, brave, beautiful, full of fire. And you," she smiled faintly, "were late to my council, as always." He laughed quietly, and their laughter drifted over the glowing city below. The years treated them kindly in their hearts, if not in their faces. Their son became a man wise and strong, beloved by the people. When he ascended the throne, he carried both their spirits within him, the grace of a ruler and the courage of a champion. When Queen Leora's final day came, Ethan sat beside her as the sun rose. She took his hand and looked at him with the same eyes that had always seen him, not as soldier, not as servant, but as the man who had given her the strength to be human. "Do you regret anything?" she whispered. He shook his head. "Not a thing." She smiled softly and closed her eyes as the sunlight touched her face. Years later, stories of the queen and her champion were told across every planet and city. They were remembered not for war or power, but for love that defied pride, for kindness stronger than any crown. And wherever people dreamed of courage and hope, their tale lived on, shining quietly in the hearts of all who still believed that being human was the greatest strength of all.